The people who hide old letters are usually terrified of old truths. I didn't think much of it when Melissa locked Richard's office after the funeral. At the time, I told myself everyone grieved differently. My son Daniel buried himself in work, my grandchildren avoided talking about their grandfather, and Melissa suddenly became the quiet organizer of everything inside our family. She handled the casseroles neighbors brought over, thanked people for flowers, and smiled with that soft, polished expression that made everyone call her strong. But exactly 1 year after my husband died, I noticed something that made the back of my neck turn cold. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon in late November, the kind where the sky turns dark before 5 o'clock and every room in the house feels heavier than usual. I was upstairs looking for the old Christmas decorations Richard always kept in the attic storage closet. He had labeled every box in thick black marker over 20 years ago. Lights, garland, nativity, fragile ornaments. Richard believed labels prevented chaos. He used to laugh and say people destroyed families faster than clutter ever could. I remember smiling at that memory as I climbed the attic stairs, until I saw the filing cabinet. It sat in the far corner beneath the small circular window, exactly where Richard had kept it for years. Gray metal, slightly dented near the bottom drawer. But now there was a thick brass padlock wrapped around it. I stopped walking. My stomach tightened immediately because Richard had never locked anything from me in 43 years of marriage. Not once. I crouched beside the cabinet and touched the cold metal lock with my fingertips. That was when I heard Melissa behind me. "Evelyn," she said sharply enough to make me jump. I turned around too quickly and nearly lost my balance. Melissa stood at the top of the attic stairs holding a laundry basket against her chest. Her face looked calm, but her eyes didn't. "What are you doing up here?" she asked. I tried to laugh lightly. "Looking for Christmas decorations." Her gaze dropped immediately to the cabinet. Just for a second, but I saw it. Fear. Real fear. Then her smile returned so quickly it almost felt rehearsed. "Oh," she said softly. "Daniel asked me to lock some of Richard's paperwork away. There were important documents inside." Something about the way she said paperwork sounded wrong. Too careful. Too prepared. I stared at the lock again before asking the question that changed everything. "Then why does it look like you're afraid of me opening it?" For the first time since my husband died, Melissa didn't answer me right away. Melissa finally smiled again after about 3 seconds, but by then I had already seen enough. People can hide anger easily. They can hide jealousy even better. Fear is harder. Fear slips through the cracks before a person can stop it. "You know how important paperwork can get after someone passes away," she said softly as she adjusted the laundry basket against her hip. "Daniel just thought it would be safer this way." I nodded slowly even though something inside me no longer believed her. Richard handled every document in our marriage himself. Insurance forms, tax returns, retirement accounts. He even kept receipts from appliances we bought 15 years ago. But he never once treated me like a stranger in my own home. Melissa walked downstairs before I could ask anything else, and I stayed in the attic another few minutes staring at that lock until the rain against the roof started making me uneasy. That night I could not sleep. The house had changed since Richard died. It no longer sounded like our home. It sounded like theirs. Around midnight I went downstairs for tea and noticed light glowing beneath the kitchen doorway. Melissa sat alone at the table with her laptop open. The moment she saw me, she minimized something on the screen so quickly it almost looked automatic. "Could not sleep either?" she asked. I forced a small smile. "Storms keep me awake these days." She nodded politely, but her eyes drifted toward the hallway leading to Richard's old office. Then she closed the laptop completely. The next morning I started noticing things I should have noticed months earlier. Richard's desk drawers had been reorganized. The framed fishing photo from our trip to Maine was missing from the hallway shelf. His navy cardigan, the one he wore every Sunday morning while reading the paper, had disappeared from the coat closet. Tiny things. Tiny enough to sound foolish if spoken aloud. But grief sharpens certain instincts instead of dulling them. After breakfast, I went into the garage looking for a screwdriver, and saw another detail that made my chest tighten. Richard's old metal file boxes were gone from the top storage shelf. I stood there staring at the empty space when Daniel walked in carrying grocery bags. "What happened to your father's boxes?" I asked casually. Daniel barely looked up. Melissa donated a bunch of old stuff last spring. I felt the air leave my lungs. Donated? He shrugged. Mom, it was just papers. Just papers. Richard used to write me letters every anniversary, every birthday, every Christmas morning before the kids woke up. Even after 40 years together, he still left handwritten notes in my purse before doctor appointments because he knew hospitals made me nervous. Those letters were never just papers. That afternoon, while Melissa picked up the grandchildren from school, I quietly opened the hallway closet searching for an old blanket. Instead, tucked behind a stack of winter coats, I found a small brass key inside one of Richard's work boots. And suddenly I understood something terrifying. My husband had hidden that key from everyone. I waited until everyone left the house before examining the key again. My hands actually trembled a little as I turned it over beneath the kitchen light. It was old brass, slightly worn at the edges, with a small strip of faded blue tape wrapped around the top. Richard always labeled important keys with colored tape. Red for storage, yellow for office cabinets, blue for personal. I had not seen blue tape in years. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, the house was quiet except for the dishwasher humming softly in the background. Daniel was still at work, Melissa had taken the grandchildren to soccer practice, and for the first time in months, I felt completely alone inside my own thoughts. I walked upstairs slowly, carrying the key in my sweater pocket like it might burn through the fabric if I held it too tightly. The attic smelled like dust and cedarwood when I climbed the narrow stairs again. Rain tapped softly against the small round window, while the locked cabinet sat waiting in the corner exactly where I had left it. For a moment I almost turned back. Not because I was afraid of what I might find, but because I suddenly realized Richard had hidden something from everyone for a reason. My husband was not dramatic. He was careful, thoughtful, quiet. If he went through the trouble of hiding a key inside an old work boot, then whatever sat inside that cabinet mattered more than I understood. I slid the key into the lock. Fit perfectly. The click echoed louder than it should have in the small attic space. Slowly, I opened the top drawer. Inside were folders arranged with the same neat precision Richard used his entire life. Tax documents, insurance papers, property records. Nothing unusual at first glance. But beneath the folders sat a small wooden box I had never seen before. Walnut wood. Smooth edges. No label. My chest tightened as I lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of envelopes tied together with a pale cream ribbon. Every single one had my name written in Richard's handwriting. Evelyn. Just seeing his handwriting again made my throat ache. I picked up the first envelope carefully and noticed something else immediately. None of them had been opened. Not one. My heart started pounding hard enough that I could hear it in my ears. Richard wrote me letters constantly throughout our marriage, but he always handed them to me personally. Anniversary cards, birthday notes, little messages left beside my coffee mug. These were different. These had stamps, mailing dates, some from almost 3 years ago. I opened the top envelope carefully, trying not to damage the paper. The letter inside was only 1 page long. The first line made my stomach drop. If you are reading this now, then someone waited far too long to let you see these. I stopped breathing for a moment. Then I heard the attic stairs creak behind me. I turned around so quickly the letter slipped from my hands onto the attic floor. Melissa stood halfway up the stairs staring directly at the open wooden box beside me. Neither of us spoke at first. The rain outside had grown heavier, tapping sharply against the attic window, while the silence between us stretched into something uncomfortable and cold. Then Melissa slowly climbed the remaining steps with one hand resting lightly on the railing. I was looking for the kids' winter coats, she said calmly, but her voice sounded thinner than usual. I bent down and picked up the letter before she could reach it. Richard wrote these to me. Her eyes dropped immediately to the stack of envelopes tied with cream ribbon. That same fear crossed her face again before disappearing beneath another controlled smile. Evelyn, she said carefully, you probably should not go through old things alone right now. Grief can make people misunderstand certain situations. I stared at her in disbelief. Misunderstand my own husband's handwriting? She folded her arms gently across her chest. I just do not want you upsetting yourself. That sentence stayed with me long after she walked back downstairs. Not because of what she said, but because of how quickly she wanted the letters out of my hands. That evening during dinner, I barely touched my food. Daniel talked about work deadlines while the grandchildren argued over mashed potatoes, and Melissa moved around the kitchen like everything was perfectly normal. But several times I caught her watching me from across the table. Not casually, carefully, like she was waiting to see whether I knew something yet. Around 8 o'clock, after everyone settled into the living room to watch television, I quietly returned upstairs with the wooden box, hidden beneath a folded blanket. My bedroom door clicked softly shut behind me. For nearly 10 minutes I just sat on the edge of the bed staring at the letters in my lap. Richard's handwriting looked steady on every envelope. Precise. Familiar. Alive. I opened another letter dated 14 months before his death. There are conversations happening in this house that you are not being included in. It began. My chest tightened immediately. The next lines felt even worse. I have tried to handle things quietly because I hoped I was wrong about certain people. But if you are reading this one day, then I need you to trust your instincts, even if Daniel asks you not to. I lowered the paper slowly. Daniel? My son had always been close to his father. Richard used to say Daniel inherited his patience and kindness. I read the sentence again 3 more times, hoping I misunderstood it somehow. Then I noticed something tucked inside the envelope behind the letter itself. A small receipt. Storage facility payment. Paid monthly. Unit 214. My heartbeat started pounding so loudly that I almost missed the sound outside my bedroom door. Someone had stopped walking in the hallway the moment I unfolded the receipt. I froze completely, still holding the receipt between my fingers while the shadow beneath my bedroom door remained perfectly still. Whoever stood outside was not passing by. They were listening. After several seconds, the floorboards creaked softly and the footsteps moved away down the hallway. I waited another full minute before opening the door carefully. The upstairs hallway was empty except for the faint television glow downstairs. But when I looked toward Daniel and Melissa's bedroom, their door was slightly open. I could hear low voices inside. Then silence. I closed my bedroom door again and locked it for the first time since moving into that house 8 years earlier. Sleep barely touched me that night. Around 6 in the morning, I finally gave up and drove to the storage facility listed on the receipt. The sun had barely risen over the highway, turning the wet pavement silver beneath the cloudy sky. Richard had rented the unit 30 miles away in a neighboring town, which immediately felt strange to me. There were closer facilities near our neighborhood. Richard hated unnecessary driving. By the time I arrived, my coffee had gone cold in the cup holder, and my nerves felt stretched thin. The storage office smelled like dust and burnt coffee. A young man behind the counter greeted me politely while typing on an old keyboard. "Can I help you?" he asked. I slid the receipt across the desk carefully. My husband rented this unit before he passed away. I am trying to locate some family documents. The employee scanned the receipt and frowned slightly at the computer screen. Unit 214 is still active. My heartbeat skipped. Still active. He nodded. Monthly payments are current. A strange heaviness settled in my stomach. Richard had been dead for over a year. Someone had continued paying for the unit after he died. Who has access to it? I asked quietly. The employee hesitated. I cannot release account information without authorization. I forced a polite smile even though my chest felt tight. I understand. Then he looked at me more carefully before lowering his voice. But I can tell you the last access entry was 3 days ago. 3 days. Melissa had visited the unit only days after I discovered the locked cabinet. My hands went cold. I thanked him, returned to my car, and sat motionless behind the steering wheel for several minutes while rain misted lightly against the windshield. Suddenly memories I had ignored for months started rearranging themselves inside my head differently. Melissa insisting on organizing Richard's paperwork immediately after the funeral. Daniel discouraging me from handling financial documents because he said it would be too stressful. The garage security code changing without anyone mentioning it to me. Even Thanksgiving last year, when Melissa abruptly changed the subject after I asked whether Richard had updated his will before he died. At the time, I convinced myself grief had made me overly sensitive. But grief was no longer the only explanation available. Before driving home, I opened another letter from Richard with trembling hands. Halfway down the page, one sentence made my breath catch instantly. If Melissa realizes you found these letters, do not let her know how much you have already learned. For the next 2 days, I pretended nothing had changed. It was the hardest thing I had done in years. Every instinct inside me wanted to confront Daniel immediately, wave Richard's letters in front of him, and demand answers. But another part of me remembered my husband's warning. Trust your instincts. Do not let Melissa know how much you have learned. So I smiled during breakfast. I folded laundry with Melissa while she talked about holiday shopping. I listened to Daniel complain about rising property taxes as if my entire world had not quietly shifted beneath my feet. Meanwhile, every moment inside that house began feeling staged, calculated. Even ordinary conversations sounded different once doubt enters them. On Sunday afternoon, Melissa suggested taking the grandchildren to the movies. You should relax while the house is quiet, she told me warmly as she zipped my granddaughter's pink winter coat. Her smile looked perfectly normal. Too normal. The moment their SUV backed out of the driveway, I went upstairs, retrieved the storage receipt, and drove straight back to the facility. This time, I parked farther away near the fence line where my car would be less visible from the office. The cold November wind cut through my sweater as I walked toward Unit 214 carrying the brass key in my pocket. My heartbeat pounded harder with every step. Rows of metal storage doors stretched endlessly down the narrow concrete lanes. Then I found it. Unit 214. A heavy gray roll-up door with a fresh lock attached to it. I stared at the lock for several seconds before trying Richard's brass key. It slid inside perfectly. My breath caught as the lock opened with a sharp metallic click. Richard had hidden the key because he wanted me to find this place eventually. I slowly lifted the storage door. The smell of paper, cedarwood, and old cardboard drifted out immediately. At first glance, the unit looked ordinary. Stacked boxes, plastic bins, old furniture covered with white sheets. But then I saw the labels written in Richard's handwriting. Bank records. Legal. Evelyn. My knees nearly gave out beneath me. I stepped farther inside and noticed something else. A folding table sat against the back wall with a small lamp plugged into an extension cord. Someone had been using this unit recently. Several file folders rested open on the table beside an empty coffee cup. Melissa had not been storing things here. She had been searching through them. My chest tightened painfully as I opened the nearest folder. Inside were copies of retirement account statements with highlighted transactions I did not recognize. Thousands of dollars moved gradually over 2 years into another account listed under Daniel's name. I flipped through more pages, my hands growing colder with every document. Then I found a sealed envelope sitting alone beneath the folders. Across the front, Richard had written only 4 words. Read this one last. Just as I touched the envelope, tires crunched outside on the gravel lane. I quickly slid the sealed envelope into my purse just as headlights swept across the thin gap beneath the storage door. My pulse hammered so hard I could barely breathe. For one terrifying second, I thought Melissa had followed me. I quietly lowered the metal door halfway and stepped behind a stack of covered furniture near the back wall. Outside, a car engine shut off. Then silence. Footsteps crunched slowly over gravel. My hands tightened around the strap of my purse while every worst possibility rushed through my head at once. The footsteps stopped directly outside Unit 214. I held my breath. Then, after several seconds, I heard keys jingling somewhere farther down the lane, followed by another storage door opening nearby. Not Melissa. Not Daniel. Just another customer. Relief hit so suddenly it almost made my knees weak. But the fear remained. Because now I understood something clearly for the first time. I was hiding from my own family. After several minutes, I stepped outside again and locked the unit carefully behind me. On the drive home, I could barely focus on traffic. My mind kept replaying the account statements I had seen inside those folders. Transfers. Withdrawals. Quiet movements of money Richard clearly wanted documented. By the time I reached the house, sunset had turned the sky dark purple behind the trees. Melissa stood in the kitchen stirring soup when I walked in. "You were gone a while," she said pleasantly. I removed my coat slowly, watching her face. "I drove out to visit Linda for coffee." Melissa smiled immediately. Too easily. "That sounds nice." She did not ask another question. That frightened me more than suspicion would have. That night, after everyone went to sleep, I locked my bedroom door again and finally opened the sealed envelope Richard labeled last. Unlike the other letters, this one contained several handwritten pages folded neatly together. I recognized Richard's serious handwriting immediately, the kind he used only when something deeply mattered to him. "Evelyn," the letter began, "if you are reading this," then I ran out of time before I could explain everything face to face. My eyes filled instantly. I sat down slowly at the edge of the bed and kept reading. Richard wrote that nearly 2 years before his death, he discovered Daniel and Melissa had been taking money from an investment account connected to my retirement savings. At first, Richard believed it was a misunderstanding. Daniel claimed he planned to return everything after a business setback. Melissa insisted they were only borrowing temporarily. But months passed, and the withdrawals continued growing larger. Richard confronted them privately several times. According to the letter, Melissa became defensive immediately while Daniel begged his father not to tell me because he feared destroying the family. My chest ached as I read each line. Then came the sentence that truly shattered me. Melissa became obsessed with making sure you never saw the updated documents. I stopped reading completely. Updated documents. My breathing turned shallow. Richard continued writing that he had begun changing legal paperwork shortly before his health declined rapidly. But afterward, some files mysteriously disappeared from his office before he could finish the process. At the bottom of the final page, Richard had underlined one final warning twice. "Do not trust what they tell you about my will." After reading Richard's warning, I stopped looking at my family the same way. It was not dramatic at first. Nothing outwardly changed inside the house. Daniel still kissed Melissa goodbye every morning before work. The grandchildren still ran through the hallway laughing after school. Melissa still asked whether I wanted more coffee during breakfast with that same gentle voice everyone admired. But now I noticed the pauses between their words. The glances exchanged when they thought I was distracted. The subtle tension whenever finances or paperwork came up in conversation. Once you discover a lie inside a family, every ordinary moment begins to feel rehearsed. 3 days later, Melissa stood beside me in the kitchen while we prepared dinner together. She chopped celery slowly while I peeled potatoes near the sink. Rain drifted softly outside the windows, and for several minutes the only sound was the cutting board beneath her knife. Then she suddenly spoke without looking at me. "Daniel worries about you being alone too much lately." I kept peeling potatoes calmly. "I have managed loneliness before." She smiled faintly. "Of course. But grief affects people differently. Sometimes it can create confusion about money or paperwork." My hand stopped moving for half a second. There it was again. Paperwork. Always paperwork. I forced myself to continue peeling slowly. "Richard handled most of that for years," I replied carefully. "I suppose I should start learning now." Melissa's knife paused against the cutting board. "That might become overwhelming." I looked up at her then. "Why does everyone keep deciding what I can handle?" For the first time, something sharp flickered across her face before disappearing again beneath politeness. "Nobody is deciding anything, Evelyn. We are only trying to protect you." Protect me. Richard used that exact phrase in his letters, except his meaning sounded entirely different. That night, after everyone went upstairs, I quietly returned to the storage unit alone. This time I searched more carefully through the boxes near the back wall. Old tax files, insurance records, legal folders organized by year. Then I found a thick binder labeled Estate Revision. My pulse quickened immediately. Inside were printed drafts of updated trust documents Richard had clearly started preparing before his death. According to those papers, he intended to move the house fully into my name and create protected accounts for the grandchildren that neither Daniel nor Melissa could directly access. But several pages were missing from the binder entirely. Torn out cleanly. Someone had removed them deliberately. I kept turning pages until a yellow legal pad slipped from the binder onto the floor. Richard's handwriting covered every line. Notes, dates, meetings with attorneys, and one sentence circled heavily near the bottom. Melissa became angry after learning Evelyn would control the final distribution. I sat frozen on the concrete floor staring at those words while cold air drifted beneath the storage door. Then another memory suddenly crashed into me without warning. 2 weeks before Richard died, I overheard muffled arguing behind his office door late at night. At the time, Daniel told me his father was frustrated over medical bills. But now I remembered something else clearly. Melissa's voice saying one sentence I did not understand back then. If she finds out what you changed, everything falls apart. That memory stayed with me the entire drive home from the storage facility. I could still hear Melissa's voice in my head from that night outside Richard's office. If she finds out what you changed, everything falls apart. At the time, I assumed they were discussing medical insurance or hospital paperwork. Now I understood the sentence differently. They were afraid of me learning what Richard planned to leave behind. When I walked into the house, the smell of cinnamon candles and roasted chicken filled the kitchen. Melissa stood near the stove humming softly, while Daniel helped my grandson with homework at the dining table. The scene looked so ordinary it almost made me question myself again. Almost. "You are home later than usual," Daniel said casually. I removed my coat slowly. Traffic was heavy near the interstate. Melissa glanced at me for only a second before returning her attention to the stove. But that second told me enough. She was watching constantly now. That evening, while everyone slept upstairs, I sat alone in my bedroom rereading Richard's letters one by one. The deeper I went through them, the clearer his fear became. He wrote about arguments with Daniel that grew more emotional over time. He wrote about missing financial documents. He wrote about Melissa insisting certain papers should be simplified before I ever saw them. Then I found one letter dated only 6 weeks before Richard died. The handwriting looked shakier than usual. "I do not believe Daniel started this," he wrote. "But I believe he became trapped inside something Melissa pushed too far to undo." I closed my eyes after reading that sentence. Daniel was still my son. I kept searching for reasons to believe he had made mistakes rather than choices. But Richard's words felt painfully careful, like a man trying to protect everyone at once while quietly realizing he could not. The next morning, Melissa knocked softly on my bedroom door holding a cup of coffee exactly the way Richard used to make it for me. 2 sugars. Splash of cream. "You seem tired lately," she said warmly as she handed me the mug. I thought this might help. I thanked her while studying her face carefully. She looked perfectly composed. Hair neat. Makeup soft and natural. Wedding ring catching morning sunlight near the doorway. The image of a devoted daughter-in-law. But suddenly I noticed something strange. Melissa only started bringing me coffee after Richard died. Before that, she rarely entered our bedroom at all. It was never kindness. It was monitoring. Later that afternoon, I quietly visited the attorney whose name appeared repeatedly throughout Richard's notes. His office sat inside a red brick building downtown beside an old insurance company. When the receptionist heard my name, her expression shifted immediately. "Mrs. Carter," she said carefully, "Mr. Hensley has been expecting you eventually." A cold chill moved through me. Eventually. As if Richard knew this day would come long before he died. 10 minutes later, I sat across from Mr. Hensley while he removed a thick folder from his desk drawer. Then he looked directly at me and asked one question that made my stomach tighten instantly. "Mrs. Carter, has your daughter-in-law ever mentioned the second will?" For several seconds I could not answer Mr. Hensley at all. The office suddenly felt too warm, too quiet, too small for what I had just heard. Second will. The words echoed inside my head while the attorney studied me carefully from across his polished oak desk. Finally, I shook my head slowly. "No," I whispered. "I only knew about the one Daniel showed me after Richard died." Mr. Hensley leaned back in his chair with a troubled expression. "Then I was afraid of this." He opened the thick folder and removed several documents clipped neatly together. "Your husband came to see me 4 times during the last 6 months of his life. He made substantial revisions to his estate plan." My hands tightened in my lap. "What kind of revisions?" Mr. Hensley hesitated before answering carefully. "The final draft transferred primary control of the family home, retirement protections, and several investment accounts directly to you." My stomach dropped. That was not the version Daniel and Melissa presented after the funeral. According to the documents they showed me, nearly everything had already been transferred jointly into Daniel's management, because Richard supposedly worried I would struggle handling finances alone. At the time I believed them. I trusted them. Richard became concerned, Mr. Hensley continued quietly. After discovering repeated withdrawals connected to accounts intended for your retirement stability. I stared at the papers while my entire marriage suddenly rearranged itself in painful new ways. Richard had not become distant during his final year because he was emotionally withdrawing from me. He had been protecting me while carrying a burden he could not fully explain before his health failed. Did he finish the new will? I asked carefully. Mr. Hensley nodded once. Yes. But the signed original disappeared before filing was completed. My chest tightened painfully. Disappeared. He folded his hands together. Your husband called me 3 days before he passed away. He sounded extremely upset. He believed someone had entered his office and removed documents from his locked file cabinet. Immediately, I pictured Melissa standing in the attic beside that locked cabinet with fear in her eyes. Mr. Hensley slid another document toward me slowly. Fortunately, your husband insisted I retain copies. I looked down at the page and nearly stopped breathing. Richard's signature sat clearly at the bottom beside dated witness lines. Real. Legal. Final. Everything Daniel and Melissa told me after the funeral had been incomplete at best and dishonest at worst. Then Mr. Hensley said something that truly shattered what remained of my trust. Mrs. Carter, after your husband died, your daughter-in-law contacted this office personally. I looked up instantly. Melissa came here? He nodded. She asked whether any revised estate documents existed beyond the version already presented to the family. My hands went ice cold. What did you tell her? Mr. Hensley's expression hardened slightly. I informed her that confidential legal matters would only be discussed with you or your husband directly. Suddenly dozens of moments from the past year became painfully clear. Melissa constantly controlling paperwork. Daniel avoiding financial conversations. The missing files. The locked cabinet. The storage unit. None of it had been grief. It had been containment. And for the first time since Richard died, I stopped feeling confused. I started feeling angry. The strange thing about betrayal is that eventually the sadness burns away and leaves something colder behind. Clarity. By the time Thanksgiving arrived, I no longer felt confused whenever Melissa smiled at me across the kitchen. I understood her now. Every polite gesture had been carefully measured. Every offer to help with paperwork had really been about control. And Daniel, my own son, had chosen silence because silence benefited him. That realization hurt more than the missing money ever could. Thanksgiving morning began exactly the way Richard loved most. Cinnamon rolls warming in the oven. Football playing softly in the living room. Grandchildren running through the house in socks while the Macy's parade flickered across the television. Melissa moved around the kitchen wearing a cream-colored sweater and pearl earrings, looking every bit like the perfect daughter-in-law she wanted the world to see. Mom, can you pass the serving tray? Daniel asked while setting the dining table. Mom. He still called me that so naturally. I wondered whether guilt ever touched him at all anymore. By late afternoon, the house filled with relatives. Daniel's sister Karen arrived with her husband. Cousins laughed over pumpkin pie. Everyone talked loudly enough to almost drown out the tension, only I could feel sitting beneath the surface. Melissa stayed close to me all evening, watching constantly without appearing obvious. Once, while refilling my tea, she leaned closer and said softly, "You seem quieter lately, Evelyn. I hope you are not worrying yourself over old papers again." Old papers. I nearly smiled at the phrase. Richard's letters rested safely inside my purse beneath the dining table, along with copies of the revised estate documents Mr. Hensley provided, along with bank statements from the storage unit, along with proof. Real proof. During dinner, Karen suddenly raised her wine glass. "I still cannot believe it has already been over a year without Richard," she said gently. "He kept this family together." The table grew quiet. Melissa lowered her eyes with practiced sadness while Daniel stared down at his plate. And in that silence I realized something important. If I waited longer, they would continue rewriting Richard's memory until even I doubted the truth he tried so hard to leave behind. So I placed my fork down carefully and stood from the table. "Actually," I said calmly, "there is something Richard wanted this family to hear." Every face turned toward me immediately. Melissa's expression changed first. Not panic. Recognition. She knew instantly. I removed one of Richard's letters slowly from my purse while the entire room stayed silent enough to hear silverware settling against plates. Before Richard died, I continued softly, he wrote me several letters that were hidden from me for over a year. Daniel's face drained of color. Melissa spoke too quickly. Evelyn, maybe this is not the right time for... No, I interrupted quietly for the first time in months. This is exactly the right time. Then I unfolded the letter and began reading Richard's words aloud. Halfway through the first page, Daniel pushed his chair back from the table so abruptly it scraped hard against the floor. Because finally, after all this time, the truth had entered the room. The dining room stayed silent after I finished reading Richard's letter. Nobody moved at first. Even the grandchildren looked confused by the tension hanging over the table like a storm nobody could escape anymore. Daniel stood near his chair staring at me with pale, exhausted eyes while Melissa remained perfectly still beside him, although I noticed her hands trembling slightly near her wine glass. Karen broke the silence first. Daniel, she whispered carefully, tell me this is not true. My son looked down at the floor instead of answering, and somehow that hurt more than any confession could have. Melissa finally inhaled sharply and stepped forward. Richard misunderstood things, she said quickly. We were under financial pressure after Daniel's business problems. We intended to fix everything. I looked at her calmly across the table. Then why hide the letters? She opened her mouth but said nothing, because there was no answer that sounded innocent anymore. Daniel rubbed both hands across his face before speaking quietly. Mom, I never wanted this to happen. I stared at my son for a long moment. It already happened. The room felt painfully heavy after that. No screaming. No dramatic explosion. Just the slow collapse of trust that had taken years to destroy. I removed the copied estate documents from my purse and placed them gently on the dining table beside the empty dessert plates. Richard finished updating his will before he died, I said softly. Melissa's face lost all remaining color. Daniel closed his eyes immediately. Mr. Hensley kept copies. Karen picked up the papers with shaking hands while the rest of the family sat frozen in silence. For the first time since Richard died, nobody interrupted me. Nobody redirected the conversation. Nobody treated me like an elderly woman too fragile to understand her own life. Later that night, after relatives quietly left the house one by one, Daniel knocked softly on my bedroom door. He looked older somehow standing there beneath the hallway light. Smaller too. I am sorry, he whispered. Tears filled his eyes exactly the way they used to when he was a little boy frightened after thunderstorms. Part of me wanted to comfort him automatically because mothers never completely stop being mothers. But another part of me finally understood something important. Loving someone does not mean allowing them to destroy your dignity. Your father tried to protect me, I said quietly, and you helped hide the truth instead. Daniel lowered his head without arguing. 3 weeks later, I moved out of the house peacefully. No court battle. No dramatic confrontation. Mr. Hensley handled the legal corrections Richard prepared long ago, and I purchased a small cottage near the North Carolina coast less than half a mile from the ocean. The mornings there smell like salt air and coffee instead of tension. Sometimes I still miss the family I thought I had. Sometimes I reread Richard's letters while sitting beside the water at sunrise. But the strangest part is this. Melissa feared those letters because she believed the truth would destroy me. Instead, the truth finally set me free. And after spending most of my life taking care of everyone else, I finally learned how to choose myself.